the grind of tearing metal, and the sharp crack of parting wire rope. Black fuel oil sprayed across the deck as the little destroyer escort slammed into the side of the escort carrier Manila Bay. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Bernard H. Kaczynski had just shouted an order that sent the ship careening into collision. The heavy rangefinder atop the pilot house crumpled under the carrier's overhanging island. Mast shrouds snapped like thread, and the whole rigging whipped dangerously. Sailors on the forecastle cut fuel hoses and axes, bit into the hawser to free the ships. But this story does not begin in that moment of chaos off Leyte Gulf. It begins more than 2 years earlier, on the morning of June 4, 1942, far to the north. A young ensign from Kansas City, named William Warner Abercrombie, sat in the cockpit of his lumbering TBD Devastator torpedo plane on the deck of the USS Hornet. He was 25 years old, quiet, and proud to be a naval aviator. That morning, he and the 14 other pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 were ordered to attack the 4 largest aircraft carriers in the Japanese Imperial Navy. They had no fighter escort. Their fuel gauges showed barely enough to reach the enemy, let alone return. The Zeros swarmed over them like hornets, more than twice as fast and infinitely more agile. One by one the Devastators fell, burning, spiraling into the sea. William Warner Abercrombie pressed his attack to within less than a mile of his target, before his plane was shot down. He did not survive. Neither did 29 of the 30 young men who took off that morning. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 was not in vain. Their desperate attack drew the enemy fighters down to sea level and disrupted Japanese flight operations. Minutes later, American dive bombers arrived unopposed and sank 3 of the 4 carriers. The tide of the war in the Pacific turned that day. For his gallantry, Ensign Abercrombie was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, and the Navy decided to honor his name by giving it to a new warship, a destroyer escort then just a steel hull under construction in Orange, Texas. On the first day of May 1944, that hull became the USS Abercrombie. A crowd gathered on the dock beside the Sabine River. In the front row sat Mr. and Mrs. C.W. Abercrombie of Kansas City. The crew of nearly 200 men stood at attention on the fantail in crisp white uniforms. A band played Sousa marches. The vice president of Consolidated Steel Corporation turned the ship over to the Navy, and the supervising official read the orders of acceptance. "Hoist the colors," he ordered. A sailor forward broke out the Union Jack at the jackstaff. Aft, another sailor ran the national ensign up the flagstaff, and amidships, a third sailor sent a commission pennant soaring to the truck. That long, narrow sliver of red, white, and blue was the symbol of a commissioned warship. It fluttered in the Texas breeze as the ship came alive. Lieutenant Commander Bernard H. Kaczynski read his orders and assumed command. He was a stocky, energetic man in his early 30s, a reservist from San Francisco with a volatile temper and a sharp professional edge. He ordered the watch set, and within minutes the quarterdeck, bridge, and engineering spaces were manned. The USS Abercrombie was now a functioning man of war. The ceremony ended with cake and punch in the wardroom. Guests toured the shining new ship, still fragrant with fresh paint. But the yard workers were already back aboard, welding and wiring. There was much work still to be done before she was ready for sea. The deck log for that first day listed 10 officers and 195 enlisted men attached to the vessel. On the morning of May 9th, the ship got underway for the first time. At 0730, the boatswain's pipe shrilled through the ship, ordering all hands to their stations for leaving port. On the forecastle, the first lieutenant stood by with his line handlers. The anti-submarine warfare officer, serving as officer of the deck, received reports from every station and saluted the captain. "All stations report manned and ready, sir," DeCosta said. Kaczynski returned the salute. "Single up your lines," he ordered. The lines were cast off, and the Abercrombie eased away from the dock. She turned downstream into the Sabine River, her screws churning the muddy water. She was underway. Once clear of the river and into the Gulf of Mexico, the general alarm sounded. The crew ran to their battle stations for the first time. It took 8.5 minutes to man all stations. Kaczynski was furious. "That is way too slow," he barked. "We'd be blown to hell before we could get off a round." He demanded it come down to 2 minutes. The ship stayed at general quarters for 2 hours, test firing every gun, checking radar and sonar, and practicing steering casualties. Seasickness plagued many of the young sailors. One of them, a slight, sandy-haired 18-year-old from Georgia named Jack Reuben Bowers, turned pale like the others, but did not seek his bunk. Instead, he grabbed a galvanized bucket from a cleaning locker and carried it with him everywhere. When he needed both hands, he hung the bucket around his neck by a lanyard. His shipmates called him Buckets from that day forward, a term of respect. The ship spent 5 days in dry dock at Galveston. Her bottom was sandblasted down to bare steel, primed and coated with anti-fouling hot plastic. It was hot, dirty work, and with no heads or showers usable, most of the crew was moved to a nearby barracks, but liberty ashore was authorized for half the crew each evening. Galveston's bars, restaurants, and casinos saw a lot of business from the new sailors. One night at a honky-tonk called the Congo Club, a dozen Abercrombie sailors gathered to celebrate the 20th birthday of a quartermaster striker. After a few drinks, they decided to all drink the same thing, so they poured whatever they had into a galvanized washtub. Beer, wine, gin, rum, whiskey, and soda water all mixed together. They drank, they toasted, and then the chairs started flying. Someone tried to swing on a chandelier. The shore patrol arrived, and the sailors went out the windows into the back streets. The brawl had consequences, a few cuts and bruises, but more importantly, it helped bond the crew. Ashore, they were no longer just sailors on liberty. They were Abercrombie sailors. They stuck together and took care of each other. That sense of identity would carry them through the long months ahead. The ship herself was growing up too, shaking down her machinery and weapons. On the evening of May 19th, the Abercrombie slipped her lines and stood out of Galveston, bound for the open Atlantic and the shakedown training that would forge her into a fighting ship. Ahead lay more than 2,000 miles of ocean, and far beyond that, the war. The commission pennant streamed from her mast, a bright symbol of the nation she served. She was ready for what was to come. The Abercrombie arrived in Bermuda on the 25th of May. For the next 4 weeks, the ship and her crew endured a relentless schedule of drills that began before sunrise and ended only at dusk. Gunnery Officer Tom Parlin, a slim, direct Pennsylvanian with steady blue eyes and a quiet authority, took charge of the weapons training. Each day the crew practiced firing at towed sleeves and surface targets, learning to coordinate their stations under the growing pressure of simulated combat. One morning at sea, Kaczynski ordered the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon to be fired. When nothing happened, the captain's face reddened as he demanded explanations from the bridge. Parlin had already countermanded the order, having spotted a crew member who was out of position and could have been injured by the recoil and blast. He climbed to the bridge and explained his decision with professional calm, and while the captain was not happy, he could not argue with the logic. The incident established a grudging respect between the two officers. During a fueling exercise with the oiler Chicopee, the seas pushed the Abercrombie hard against the tanker's side. The starboard bow made momentary contact, bending lifeline stanchions and scratching the paint on both ships. It was a minor collision, but a vivid lesson in the difficulty of close maneuvering in heavy weather. During these weeks, news arrived of a sister DE, the USS England, which sank 6 enemy submarines in 12 days. The crew of the Abercrombie took heart, their weapons worked. By the end of the Bermuda stay, the crew could man their battle stations in 3.5 minutes, down from the 8.5 that had so angered the captain on the first day at sea. On the 25th of June, the Abercrombie steamed into Boston Navy Yard shrouded in heavy fog. For 10 days, yard workers installed a new combat information center, repainted the ship's bottom, and completed scores of repair jobs that the shakedown had revealed. Half the crew went on leave, while the other half stood watch and enjoyed liberty in the city. The ship was being readied for the long journey to the Pacific. One afternoon, a young ensign from the training command came aboard to inspect the gunnery department. Without checking the chamber, he pulled the trigger of a .45 caliber automatic pistol. The round slammed into the steel overhead and ricocheted through the passageway, the roar deafening in the confined space. Parlin ordered the ensign off the ship immediately. No one was hurt, but the bullet hole in the wardroom overhead remained as a permanent reminder of the cost of complacency. On the 6th of July, the Abercrombie stood out of Boston and headed south, escorting 2 fleet oilers and 2 smaller gasoline tankers bound for Aruba. The passage was hot and humid, and the ship's sonar burned out a critical component just before arrival. The captain insisted the crew be armed with small arms and grenades. A sister DE, the Buckley, had recently been forced to repel boarders from a U-boat, and he was determined the Abercrombie would be ready to respond in kind. In Cristobal, Panama, the crew worked around the clock to repair the equipment while the ship took on fuel and stores. The ship pressed on toward the canal and the open waters of the Pacific. On the 1st of August, the Abercrombie entered the Panama Canal. The locks lifted the hull up into Gatun Lake, where the crew took a brief swim in the cool, fresh water, a welcome relief from the tropic heat. By nightfall, the ship had crossed into the Pacific, 27 miles east of her starting point. For many of the young sailors, it was their first glimpse of the ocean where the real war was being fought. After clearing the Panama Canal on the 1st of August, the Abercrombie set course for San Diego in company with the Oberenda and the tanker Nantahala. The passage was calm and idyllic, the sea smooth and the weather warm. One afternoon, a magnificent man-o'-war bird perched on the rotating radar antenna, riding the moving dish for hours before soaring away. The ship reached San Diego on the 11th of August, ready for the final round of preparation before Pearl Harbor. The Abercrombie-119's stay in San Diego was a brief respite from the grind of preparation. For 11 days, the crew enjoyed liberty, with many men reunited with wives and families who had traveled west to meet them. The accordion, stolen weeks earlier in Cristobal, was quietly resolved when Kaczynski, showing a lenient side, restricted the two sailors to the ship but spared them a court-martial. Baseball games on the base and last-minute training sessions filled the days, but the shadow of the Pacific War hung over every pleasure. On the afternoon of August 22nd, the Abercrombie slipped her moorings and stood out of San Diego harbor. The high cape of Point Loma fell astern as the ship settled onto a course for Pearl Harbor. For many of the young sailors, this was the final glimpse of the American mainland, and the mood on deck was quiet and reflective. Ahead lay the immense expanse of the Pacific and the unknown. The ship arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 29th of August, sliding past Diamond Head and into the familiar anchorage. For the next 3 weeks, the crew threw themselves into an intensified training curriculum. Anti-aircraft practice against towed sleeves, torpedo evasion drills with TBF Avengers, and carrier screening operations with the Manila Bay sharpened their skills. The exercises were realistic and demanding, and the crew began to feel like a seasoned team. There was a serious problem with the main battery. After sustained firing, both 5-inch guns jammed when their operating shafts bound up from the heat. Assistant Gunnery Officer Red Bond diagnosed the issue at Pearl Harbor and attempted to remedy it during the passage to Manus by lathing down the shafts in the ship's machine shop. But the test firings en route revealed the problem persisted. At Manus, Bond took a calculated risk. Without authorization from the ordnance officer on the tender, he carefully lathed 7/1000ths of an inch off each shaft, reinstalled them, and test-fired the guns. They worked perfectly, and the Abercrombie finally had a fully reliable main battery as she prepared for combat. On the 19th of September, the Abercrombie departed Pearl Harbor in company with the tanker General Hayes, bound for the Admiralty Islands. The passage was calm and uneventful, a welcome lull after weeks of intense drills. The ship crossed the equator, and the crew held a raucous initiation ceremony for the polywogs, with King Neptune presiding and the shellbacks administering humiliating but good-natured ordeals. The ritual helped bond the men, many of whom were facing their first deployment. Early on the morning of the 30th of September, the ship entered Sayadla Harbor at Manus. The anchorage was crowded with warships of every description. Escort carriers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft stretched across the calm waters. It was clear that a major operation was being assembled. The Abercrombie dropped anchor, and the crew looked out at the gathering fleet with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The next push would take them to the Philippines, and from there, into the heart of the war. The Abercrombie departed Manus on the afternoon of October 14th, steaming west with the Susans and 2 escort carriers. They joined a vast armada of landing craft, transports, and warships bound for the Philippines. For 9 days, the force plodded across the Philippine Sea at 8 knots, the DEs screening ahead of the carriers. Kaczynski announced over the public address system that their objective was Leyte Gulf and the liberation of the islands. On the morning of October 23rd, a Wildcat fighter from the escort carrier Kadashan Bay crashed on takeoff. The pilot plunged into the sea just off the Abercrombie's bow. The ship went to general quarters and manned plane crash stations. The whaleboat was swung out and lowered away. Stafford led the whaleboat crew, along with pharmacist's mate Vic Bohr and machinist's mate Jim Triplett. They rowed toward the survivor, a tiny dark head bobbing in the swells. The pilot, Lieutenant Gerald Lee Bridge, was conscious and even managed a joke as they pulled him aboard. He had a gash on his head, heavy bruises, and 2 black eyes from the impact. Bohr treated Bridge in sick bay, sewing up his wound and binding his bruises. By early afternoon, the pilot was transferred by Bridge's boy to the carrier Marcus Island. The crew felt a quiet pride in their first rescue, but they knew this was only a taste of what lay ahead. 2 days later, at dawn on the 25th, the Abercrombie was at general quarters. Radar had picked up enemy surface forces to the northwest. Over the speakers came the report of battleships and heavy cruisers closing at high speed. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were already under fire. From the Abercrombie's deck, the crew saw towering yellow splashes on the northern horizon. Over the radio came fragmentary reports of desperate fighting. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans, had charged the Japanese column, launching torpedoes and taking heavy damage. The destroyer Hoel and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, followed suit, pressing their attacks against overwhelming odds. By mid-morning, the Japanese had broken off and retreated, but the cost was severe. The Johnston, the Hoel, and the Roberts were lost. Commander Ernest E. Evans did not survive the loss of the Johnston. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, commanding the Samuel B. Roberts, survived the battle and the long hours in the water, returning home after the war. The Abercrombie, screening with Taffy 2, had not been in direct combat, but the crew had seen enough. The following afternoon, she moved alongside the escort carrier Manila Bay for fueling. The collision crushed the rangefinder and severed the mast shrouds. Boatswain's mate, second-class Pete Kish, took charge of the repair. He spliced the Manila Bay's heavy wire into the broken shrouds, working steadily as the ship rolled. By evening, the mast was secure, and Kish's fix became a permanent part of the ship. The Abercrombie returned to Manaus in early November, her crew grateful for mail and movies that awaited them. On the morning of November 10th, a massive explosion ripped through the anchorage. The ammunition ship Mount Hood had detonated, killing 372 men and wounding 371 more. A towering brown cloud rose over the harbor, and debris rained down across the fleet. The Abercrombie's whaleboat was launched immediately, with Parlin, chief pharmacist's mate Charles Bailey, and Boer aboard. They found only scattered debris and empty life jackets where the Mount Hood had been anchored. There were no survivors to rescue. The crew returned to the ship in silence, shaken by the scale of the destruction. In the days that followed, the crew helped clean up the anchorage and tended to damaged ships. The Oberenda, their sister ship, had been hit by heavy debris and required extensive repairs. The Abercrombie herself had escaped serious damage. The men turned to preparing for the next operation, knowing the war was far from over. By early December of 1944, the Abercrombie had shaken off the pall of the Mount Hood disaster. The ship got underway from Manaus and steamed southeast toward the Solomon Islands, bound for Cape Torokina on Bougainville. There the crew would rehearse a new and dangerous role, control vessel for an amphibious assault. For 2 weeks, the ship anchored off the jungle-clad coast, and each morning she got underway to practice positioning herself precisely off a rehearsal beach. The men watched as waves of landing craft formed up on her signal flags and headed for shore, learning the intricate choreography that would be required in combat. The days at Bougainville offered a rare blend of work and rest. Ashore, the Seabees had built a base with a movie theater they called Lois Torokina and an officers' club that served only beer and coke. The crew played softball on dusty diamonds, swam in the warm shallows, and drank their ration of canned beer under the palms. Evenings brought movies on the fantail, the projector humming as the tropical darkness settled over the anchorage. For a few hours each night, the war felt distant, and the young sailors could almost forget the steel hull that carried them. The Abercrombie returned to Manaus just before Christmas. The harbor was still crowded with warships, but the mood shifted as the holiday approached. Mail arrived in heavy sacks, and the crew devoured letters and packages from home that had been held for weeks. The galley crew outdid itself, And on Christmas Day, the mess hall served a dinner that rivaled Thanksgiving: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The menu cover, drawn by boatswain's mate Fred Manger, showed Santa Claus in a grass skirt being towed by mermaids. For a few hours, the war stopped, but the respite was brief. On the morning of December 27th, the Abercrombie slipped her moorings and stood out of Sadler Harbour. She joined a massive formation of transports, landing craft, and escorts, all bound for the western coast of Luzon. The destination was Lingayen Gulf, and the objective was the liberation of Manila. The crew knew the route would take them through narrow, contested waters, past enemy-held airfields, and into the heart of kamikaze country. There was no bravado now, only a quiet, professional readiness. The invasion force threaded Surigao Strait on the night of January 5th. Stafford had the midwatch, and he never forgot it. Moonlight broke through warm rain squalls, revealing the dark masses of hundreds of ships moving in precision, guided by radar and the clipped orders on the TBS circuit. The same waters had boomed with battleship fire just 10 weeks before, and the ghosts of that fight lay somewhere beneath the keel. Then, without warning, a destroyer ahead reported torpedoes in the water. A midget submarine had attacked. The destroyer swung hard, depth-charged the tiny craft, and reported it sunk. The column never slowed. All night, the bogies appeared on the radar scope, hovering at the edge of detection. The new P-61 Black Widow night fighters circled overhead, their twin booms black against the stars. One of them flared its engines, lined out toward a contact, and a few minutes later came the laconic report: bogey destroyed. On the Abercrombie's bridge, the watchstanders strained their eyes into the darkness, their hands never far from the triggers of the ready guns. The ship ran blacked out, her wake barely visible, slipping through the enemy's backyard. On January 7th, the formation entered the Sulu Sea, and the reports from ahead grew grim. The cruiser Columbia had been hit by a kamikaze, the Australia had been struck, the escort carrier Omoni Bay had been set afire and sunk. 16 ships had been damaged in 3 days. The men of the Abercrombie listened to the reports in silence. This was not the distant thunder of Samar. This was coming straight at them. The night of January 8th was the longest. The Abercrombie crept forward at 8 knots, her guns trained skyward, her lookouts searching for the black shape that would be the last thing they ever saw. The radar scope never cleared. Enemy planes circled just beyond the horizon, testing the defenses. The crew remained at general quarters for hours, the only sounds the hum of the blowers and the steady ping of the sonar. Then, just before dawn, the ship entered Lingayen Gulf, and the low dark line of Luzon appeared ahead. At first light on January 9th, the Abercrombie began her approach to the beach. On the bridge, Kaczynski cross-checked the bearings against the chart and found the navigator's coordinates were dangerously off. He hurled a curse down the voice tube and ordered the engines astern, backing the ship down the line of departure until the landmarks matched the chart. On the forecastle, Holloway stood ready with a sledgehammer to knock the Pelican hook loose. Groon had prepared the anchor chain for quick release, greasing the connecting link so it could be separated in seconds. A buoy made from a 5-inch powder can was rigged, painted with the words, "Here lies the anchor of the USS Abercrombie." If the kamikazes came, the ship would not be tied to the bottom. She could slip her cable and fight. At 7 o'clock, the anchor went down. The signal light began to flash the letter Able, and the landing craft formed up astern. Then the Zeros came. 3 of them dropped out of the low overcast, slanting down from the west. The Abercrombie's guns opened up, the 40mm hammering, the 20s pouring tracers into the sky. The lead plane kept coming, growing larger in the sights, then banked hard at the last second and dove straight for the cruiser Columbia, 500 yards away. The explosion was instant and brutal. A streak of flame ran down the plane's flight path into the Columbia's forward director, and the structure vanished in a ball of fire. 24 men died in that single impact. 68 more were wounded. The cruiser paused, her 6-inch guns silent for 20 minutes, then opened up again, firing faster than before. The Abercrombie had been spared by yards. There was no time to dwell on it. The landing craft were forming up, and the control vessel had work to do. All morning the waves went in, amphibious tanks, tracked landing vehicles, and LCVPs packed with troops. The Abercrombie marked the line of departure with her signal light, and wave after wave passed down her sides. By 10 o'clock, Lingayen airstrip was in American hands. By noon, the last wave was ashore. The anchor came up, the buoy was recovered, and the Abercrombie steamed out of the Gulf, her job done. She had been a lighthouse in a storm of steel, and she had not faltered. 3 days later, the Abercrombie was steaming south through the Surigao Strait once more, escorting empty transports back to Leyte. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the tension of the past week began to ease. Then the lookout reported a capsized outrigger canoe with 3 men perched on its keel. The ship circled slowly, and the castaways made their needs clear by patting their stomachs and pointing at their mouths. The whaleboat was lowered, and Stafford went over the side with his .45 as a precaution. The 3 survivors were young, brown-skinned, and ragged. They walked out along the outrigger to meet the whaleboat, carrying 2 straw baskets that were searched for weapons. Nothing was found. They were brought aboard, and Da Costa questioned them in Spanish. Their names were Tarciano Patino, Pedro Clarin, and Candido Pongueras. They had been adrift for 4 days after their outrigger capsized in the typhoon. 3 others had drowned, including the sister of one of the boys. They claimed to be anti-Japanese guerrillas and carried over $100,000 in Philippine currency. The captain ordered them placed under guard and isolated from the crew. They were given hot showers, a hot meal, and clean clothes. Mattresses were laid out for them on the main deck, and all 3 fell asleep almost instantly. A few days later, Wheeling led a detail that delivered the boys to naval authorities in Tacloban, a muddy 15-mile trek from the anchorage. It was a small human moment in a brutal campaign, and it reminded the crew that there were still people to save in this war. The Abercrombie spent the rest of January shuttling between Leyte, Mindoro, and Biak, escorting troop convoys and patrolling for submarines. The routine was exhausting. Dawn and dusk general quarters, hours of steaming in formation, and the constant vigilance against an enemy that might appear at any moment from the sky or from below the sea. The crew grew weary, but they did not grow careless. The lessons of Samar and Lingayen had been learned. There were no shortcuts in a combat zone. The air raids continued. One evening, a pair of enemy planes slipped through the cap and dove on the formation. The Abercrombie's guns opened up. But the planes were fast and determined. One of them dropped a bomb that straddled a transport astern. The other flew straight into the side of an LST, erupting in flame. The crew watched in grim silence. This was the new face of war. Not a battle between fleets, but a relentless series of individual fanatical attacks that had to be beaten off one at a time. By early February, the Abercrombie was back in Leyte Gulf, anchored in San Pedro Bay. The ship had been underway for most of 6 weeks, and the men were exhausted. Then, on the 10th, a boat arrived from the fleet post office with mail. 3,000 bags had been sitting in the warehouse, unsorted, and the crew had gone weeks without word from home. When the mail finally came aboard, the mood of the ship transformed. Men sat on the deck reading letters, turning over photographs, and smiling for the first time in weeks. The Abercrombie had survived the gauntlet of Lingayen. She had served as a control vessel, an anti-submarine screen, a plane guard, and a transport escort. She had been attacked by kamikazes and had escaped without a scratch. Her crew was tired, but they were also confident. They had seen the worst the enemy could offer, and they were still afloat. The next operation was already being planned, and it would take them even closer to the Japanese home islands. But that was still a secret. For now, there was mail, there was rest, and there was the knowledge that they had earned their place in the line. The Abercrombie sailed from Leyte Gulf in late March of 1945, bound for the next great objective. The operation was code-named Iceberg, and its target was Okinawa, a large island just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. For the crew, the destination carried an unmistakable weight. This would be the closest they had come to the enemy's heartland, and the reports from Lingayen had made clear what awaited them there. The kamikaze had not been a passing terror, it was a doctrine. On the 1st of April, the Abercrombie took her screening station as the invasion waves went ashore at Okinawa. Her job was plane guard and anti-submarine patrol for the escort carriers, and that meant long hours of high-speed maneuvering as the CVEs launched and recovered their constant cycles of strikes. The ship stayed buttoned up at general quarters for most of each day. the crew tense and watchful under a sky that was never empty of aircraft. The air raids came with the regularity of a tide, and the radar scope was rarely clear. But the Abercrombie was lucky. She dodged the falling bombs, her gunners tracking and firing at the fast-moving specks that screamed down from the clouds. She picked up 3 pilots who had ditched their damaged planes. Each rescue was the same urgent ballet of whaleboat and line and stretcher, and each one reinforced the crew's grim, quiet competence. The ship herself took no serious damage. By mid-June, Okinawa was declared secure, and the Abercrombie moved north into the East China Sea. The mission now was pure escort and anti-submarine patrol, hunting the enemy's remaining submarines along the convoy routes to the still active war in the Pacific. The sea was wide and empty, the radar scopes flat and silent for days at a time. The crew began to feel the strange, suspended quality of a war that was winding down but not yet over. A typhoon caught the ship in late June, winds building to fury and seas piling up in grey, moving walls. The Abercrombie rode it out, heeling and shuddering under the blows of the waves, her storm shutters dogged tight and her pumps running steady. No serious damage was done, and when the sky cleared, the men who had survived Samar and Lingayen took the storm as just another day's work. They had earned the right to be unimpressed. In early August, the news came over the radio from the ship's receivers. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and then another on Nagasaki. The crew listened in silence, trying to grasp the scale of what had happened. A few days later, the word came that Japan had surrendered. There was no cheering at first, just a slow, tired release of tension. Men looked at each other and realized they would live. The Abercrombie anchored in Tokyo Bay in early September, surrounded by the grey hulls of the fleet. The war was over. The ship was ordered to assist in minesweeping operations and to support the repatriation of Japanese troops from the outlying islands. The crew worked alongside former enemies who now moved with the dazed politeness of men who had lost everything. The contrast was jarring. Liberty in Yokosuka was a strange, hollow experience. The town was still scarred by bombing, and the people kept their eyes down. The sailors walked through the rubble and the quiet markets, buying cheap souvenirs and trying to feel something other than fatigue. Liberty in Busan, Korea, was similar, though the faces of the Korean people were different, watchful and uncertain. The crew was glad to return to the clean, known metal of their ship. The 8 original officers had long since scattered. Tom Parlon and Cyrus de Costa had been transferred home. Bernard Kaczynski had turned over command and departed for the States. New men filled the wardroom, and the watchbills carried names that were unfamiliar to the old hands. But the ship remained the same, her hull still scarred from the collision with Manila Bay, her rangefinder still dented from that frantic day off Samar. In October, the Abercrombie weighed anchor and set course for home. The passage was slow and deliberate, a long withdrawing wake across the Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, the ship paused long enough for the crew to see the sunken Arizona, still leaking oil, and to understand the arc they had traveled. Then came San Diego, where the first Liberty boats carried men who had been boys when they left, now returning as veterans of a brutal war. The final leg of the voyage was the short run to Orange, Texas, the same yard where the keel had been laid in the fall of 1943. The ship tied up at the same wooden dock on the Sabine River. The crew packed their sea bags, and on the 2nd day of March 1946, the Abercrombie was decommissioned. The commission pennant was hauled down, the guns were silenced, and the ship that had held 200 men through typhoon and battle became a quiet hull. Most of the crew returned to civilian life. Howard Amos, the helmsman who had steered the ship through her most critical maneuvers, survived the war and returned to his family in Baltimore. Ted Gruen, promoted to chief carpenter's mate before the end of the war, settled in California. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland lived to see the end of the war and received the Navy Cross for his actions. Bernard Kaczynski went back to California, his temper and his competence both recorded in the deck logs. Edward Stafford returned to Vermont to his wife and young son, carrying the images of those 20 months on the little ship. Tom Parlon, Cyrus de Costa, and Albert Holloway Each returned to the quiet of their civilian lives, their service known to the men who sailed with them. The Abercrombie herself ended her days as a target, sunk by missile fire in 1968, 22 years after she left commission. But the memory of what she did and what her men endured is not measured in steel or wreckage. It is measured in the quiet courage of the men who stood their watches, who went to battle stations in the dark, who gave everything they had and, in the end, came home. If you have a family story from the Pacific War or a memory of a loved one who served on a ship like the Abercrombie, we invite you to share it in the comments below. We read each one and carry them forward. And if this documentary brought that history closer, please consider subscribing and giving this video a like. It helps us continue to tell these stories. Thank you for listening.